I'm talking to camera rather than drawing right now because I don't want what I'm drawing to distract attention from what I'm saying, because at this point right now it's the concepts, it's the thinking which I really believe can totally revolutionize our drawing of trees, and particularly if we're not happy with the way our trees look at the moment. But in case at the end you want to see how this looks in practice, I've added a sped up version of a drawing I did from the over 50 videos on my How to Draw a Tree playlist that really cover everything you'll ever need to know about drawing trees. And in case you haven't seen my playlist and drawing trees are an issue, the end screen of the video will take you to that playlist if you want to see what's available there. My focus in this video is how we think, because what we draw is filtered through our thinking. Now, it starts with our observation of our subject and whether we observe in life, in a photo reference, or whether we're observing within our imagination. Whichever way we observe, that observation is filtered through our creative thought processes before it becomes lines and marks on paper. So many of the weaknesses in drawing trees and foliage in particular, I think, can come from jumping too quickly from observation to lines and marks on paper. So this filtering through our thought processes makes more important what's the best way to think when I'm observing and drawing trees. Now again, from looking at drawings of trees, I think a common process is to look at a tree, to particularly observe its shape, its outline, and to draw a line to capture that outline. And that outline can include the trunks and the branches as well as the foliage in the canopy. And as part of our observation, we see all the leaves, and I think this is where the real problem comes from. I see all these leaves and I know what they are. I'm very familiar with leaves. But now my mind is filled with thinking of how many leaves I'm looking at and how can I possibly draw these with my pen. And so I start to do lines to try and represent the leaves in some way, but often it's just overwhelming and I end up creating a sort of a leaf pattern which I use to fill in the silhouette outline that I've already drawn. And while my drawing does look like a tree, anyone who saw it would have no doubt that I've drawn a tree. If I'm honest, it looks caught halfway between a realistic looking tree and something that's more like a cartoon. And that's not hugely satisfying for me. So then, what's a better way? Well, I observe the same tree, but instead of looking at the shape of a tree, I observe the form of the tree as my starting point. See, shape defines a two-dimensional thing, a flat surface, whereas form captures the sense of 3 dimensions. Shape, 2 dimensions, height and breadth. Form, 3 dimensions, height, breadth and depth. And this can take some work with our observation and our thinking, just to see the tree canopy as a form rather than a shape. Because one of the unfortunate effects of a camera is that it flattens what we see. And particularly trees visually get compressed into 2 dimensions, so it can actually be hard to see the form. We have to look at the tree, look at the branching, work out what parts of this canopy are coming closer to me and what parts of this canopy are further back. Because this also affects, or could affect, the way I draw them, to understand their relative position to me as I observe this tree. So our brain needs to undo what the camera has done in turning 3D into 2D and to put the 3D form back into my mind so I can then draw it more effectively. But I think it's also helpful if I realize that when I draw anything, I'm not really drawing the thing, I'm creating a representation of the actual object wherever it might be. Or we could think of it as I'm putting lines and marks on my paper to capture the effect of how this object looks in my reference, in my mind, in front of me. Because how this particular item looks will depend on the weather conditions, the things around it, the distance I am from it, the angle I am looking at it from, and so forth. All of these elements together create a certain visual effect, and I want to capture that effect. And this is particularly true with tree canopies. Because the problem is, we see the leaves, we understand leaves, we think of leaves, but key to this way of thinking is to not think of leaves at all. And if possible, unless the tree leaves are very large or they're quite close to us, to try not to even see the leaves, but to see the tree canopy as a form, as an undulating, curving series of forms placed together that capture light and cast shadows in certain ways. And I want to capture the effect of that for the particular tree I'm drawing. Most of the time when I'm drawing a tree, most of the work, most of the marks for that drawing of that tree is actually spent creating the effect of the shadows and of the shade, creating the effect of where parts of the tree are simply turned away from the light source, or where other parts of the tree higher up cast a shadow that goes across the tree, that falls across various parts of the lower tree canopy, or even across branches or parts or all of the trunk. What marks will capture the visual effect of these darkened areas and capture it in a way that reflects the surface texture of the leaf canopy. I wish you could smell this, but because the shadows capture the form visually, the form of the tree often far more prominently than the lit areas capture the form of the tree, of the canopy, we find ourselves therefore drawing the shaded, shadowed areas. But the other area that is vital for us to pay attention to in our observation and then in our thinking, in the translation from what I'm seeing to marks on the paper, is the silhouette outline of our tree. Trees have very distinct silhouette edges when we see them up against the sky, which is a fairly common way of seeing trees. But exactly what we see depends on the size of the leaves. It depends on the shape of the leaves. It depends on how many of the leaves are bunched together. It depends on the way the leaves are actually attached to the twigs. It depends on the form of the leaf, whether it's a rigid leaf or whether it bends with gravity. And how it looks with all of these things considered will also often change according to the distance we're viewing the leaf from, the canopy from. What we might see close up, we may not see very clearly further away. We may not see it all from the far distance. All of these issues we take into consideration in our head as we're looking at the silhouette outline of the tree, working out what's characteristic about this silhouette edge and what marks can I use on my paper to capture that effect, taking into account any other factors that may be happening with that particular tree that I'm drawing. By tailoring my thinking to the specific tree and the specific foliage that I'm looking at, I avoid the problem of all my trees looking pretty much the same, of developing, if you like, a generic tree style of drawing, where when I see there's a tree to draw, it's like I flick a switch and go, oh, okay, now I do one of my tree drawing techniques here. Instead of ransacking visually what I'm seeing in my reference and working out how can I create marks to capture that effect in the greater context of my scene. And one thing to remember is that very often the sort of marks that capture the silhouette edge well in creating the effect of the outline of that tree are often helpful marks to actually use within the canopy of the tree. As we seek to define the parts of the canopy that are in light or in shade or shadow, often those marks are the sort of marks then that help to reinforce what we're seeing at the edges, but also to create more generally the effect of that particular type of tree at that distance. And I think this drawing technique, this focus on the way we think, is just as important, just as helpful in drawing trees in winter with their bare branches. Once the branching starts to get too complex, rather than looking at the shapes of all the branches, it's far more helpful, I believe, to be looking at the effect of all the bare branches massed together. And that effect includes what we can or can't see through them, how much they do or don't block whatever's on the other side visually, because how we draw what we see through them will possibly define the branches or the effect of all of the bare branches far more effectively than trying to draw the actual branches themselves. We've got to stop thinking of shapes and objects that we think we know what they look like, and instead focus on what am I seeing in this particular scene, and how do I capture that in my marks. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this helpful. So here's a sped up version of me putting this way of thinking into practice, just in case you haven't seen any of my tree drawing videos. And if you'd like to see them or see more or see how this works for bare branches, then check out my How to Draw a Tree playlist, the link of which you'll see towards the end. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye. This is a tall eucalypt at Port Arthur in Tasmania, and I think it's a good demonstration of the way of thinking that I've just talked about being put into practice with a particular example, a particular tree. This drawing took me 27 minutes to do in real time, so you're watching it at about 9 times my actual drawing speed. You can see it a lot slower if you go to the actual video that this came from, and which also has a voiceover attached to it explaining what I'm doing as I do it. But for now, I'll leave you just to observe what I said earlier being put into practice. And if you give it a go drawing this tree yourself, have fun. I'll see you next video. Bye.